one.
My name is Natasha Korecki. I'm the author of Politico's Illinois Playbook. If you are a subscriber, yes, I am the one guilty of clogging your inbox with very unwelcome news, usually in the state of Illinois and around the country. On behalf of Politico, we are proud to be part of a night that showcases the important work of investigative journalism. Congratulations to all the winners tonight, and thank you to the BGA for all of your contributions to the journalism community. And truly, some of those stories tonight, sincerely, they brought tears to my eyes. Just some of the things you guys do is really, really important. I'm incredibly honored to have the pleasure of introducing this evening's featured guest. He is a legend in the news business. He is an editor known for his persistence and dedication to creating real impact with news investigations. Under his leadership, 3 news teams have won 12 Pulitzer Prizes. Hollywood was so impressed, they produced an Academy Award-winning movie about Spotlight investigation at the Boston Globe. And Dean Baquet, the executive editor of New York Times, calls him the best news editor he's ever known. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Marty Baron.
Let's see. Is my microphone? So should I use this one? And Marty, you could say 3, 2, 1, Marty.
3, 2, 1.
Can you hear? Is Marty's mic on? Can you hear him? Try one more time.
3, 2, 1.
Yeah. Well, Marty, thanks so much for joining us. I know you're fighting a cold tonight, and that means you will not be your normal gregarious, obstreperous self. If you saw the movie, you will realize that to say that Marty is understated is an understatement. And we have a lot to talk about, but I thought what we would do is we're going to play a clip from Spotlight, not because of its Hollywood value, but because I think some of the dialogue in that clip basically begs the questions that I'm going to be asking Marty about news and investigations and taking on institutions and the things that investigative journalism does, that he did at the Milwaukee, that he did at the Miami Herald and the Boston Globe, and now at the Post. And so let's play this clip again, not for its Hollywood value, but because it's actually demonstrable of what's going on. Whether the dialogue is true or false, he can tell us. But more importantly, I think the themes will give us a really good jumping off point for our conversation. So, Judy, let's roll this tape and then we can talk.
New boss coming in to make some cuts?
I have no idea. We keep our work confidential.
What are you working on now?
You anticipate more cuts?
I think I'm gonna need to take a hard look at things. What I'm more focused on right now is finding a way to make this paper essential to its readers.
I like to think it already is.
I just think that we can do better.
Do you want to say something, Marty?
Sure. I'm delighted to be here. If you could tell me your name as we go around, that'd be helpful. Thank you. The fact remains, a Boston priest abused 80 kids. We have a lawyer who says he can prove law knew about it, and we've written all of 2 stories in the last 6 months. This strikes me as an essential story to a local paper. I think at the very least, we have to go through those documents.
The church will read that as us suing them. So will everybody else.
Good to know.
Gutsy call for the first day. That's one word for it.
Judging from what I've read, it doesn't seem like we've done a very thorough investigation into the Gagan case. Is that right?
Marty, in past Spotlights had success in large part because they picked their own projects.
Would you consider picking this one? I'd like to challenge the protective order in the Gagan case.
You want to sue the Catholic Church?
We're just filing a motion, but yes.
You think it's that important?
Yes, I do.
I find that this city flourishes when its great institutions work together.
Personally, I'm of the opinion that for a paper to best perform its function, it really needs to stand alone. We need to focus on the institution, not the individual priests. Practice and policy Show me the church manipulated the system so that these guys wouldn't have to face charges. Show me they put those same priests back into parishes time and time again. Show me this was systemic, that it came from the top down. We're going after the system. I think that's the bigger story.
Bigger than 50 priests.
If it came from the top down, yes. Sometimes it's easy to forget that we spend most of our time stumbling around in the dark. Suddenly a light gets turned on and there's a fair share of blame to go around. All of you have done some very good reporting here. Reporting that I believe is going to have an immediate and considerable impact on our readers. For me, this kind of story is why we do this.
Hey, Robbie, new boss coming in to make some
Well,
cuts?
aside from being better looking than Liv Schreiber,
I think just the reverse. But
okay. So let's pick up on a couple of themes because I think that's what really speaks to what's going on today. You walk into a new newspaper and they don't know you and you don't know them. And how do you, and what are you facing? And maybe you faced it in Washington, but you walk into a company town, as it were, a town that's very Catholic, that reveres the church, and stuff's been going on that isn't being reported. How do you turn the ship, as it were?
Right. Well, when I went to Boston, I did not know anybody in the newspaper, and I didn't know anybody in the city. So I had no friends there or anything like that, and I had no alliances or loyalties or anything like that in the newsroom. But what had happened there was, just as the movie portrays, I had read this column by a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist, Eileen McNamara. It appeared the day before I was to start work at the Boston Globe, and it talked about this priest who had been accused of abusing as many as 80 children. And it said at the end that the allegation from the plaintiff's lawyer was that the cardinal himself knew about this abuse and yet continually reassigned the priest from parish to parish where he abused again and again. And also that and then the church said these were baseless charges, these were irresponsible charges. And at the end of the column, she said, the truth may never be known because these documents are under seal. And to me, when somebody says the truth may never be known, that should be like chum to journalists. And so that's why I just felt like, to me, there was a journalistic impulse. It wasn't a matter of trying to turn the ship. I didn't really know anything about the history of the Boston Globe. I hardly knew anything about Boston. So it was a matter of just coming in the next day, and I listened, as the movie portrays, to everybody talking about what they were working on, and nobody mentioned this story. And so at the end, I asked, well, what about this? What are we doing to follow up? And can we get past this idea of one side saying one thing and the other side saying something else? And somebody said, well, the documents are under seal. And I said, I know that, I read that. But had we thought about the possibility of going to court to unseal those documents? I didn't know what the laws of Massachusetts were. I was coming from Florida. But in Florida, which has a very expansive public records law, and these weren't public records, but we had a habit of just routinely trying to open things up. And so I asked whether we had thought about doing that, and I think there was a general sense of shock. This was my first meeting on my first day at the Boston Globe. I don't think that they were expecting their new editor to be talking about going to court against the Catholic Church. But there we were, and we just went right ahead.
How much did they buy in pretty quickly? Last year, many of you attended, and we had your three reporters. We had Robbie and Sasha and Mike, and we had a wonderful conversation about the story. And Robbie acknowledged that they had dropped the ball, that the institutional culture of Boston was such that the church was somewhat off limits. And so you had to basically get buy-in from the staff to attack one of the key institutions in a major city. And I want to ask you how you did that. Was it just by being their boss? And what is that message? Is there a message there for a city like Chicago, which for many years could have been viewed as a company town, in which the media was perhaps too cozy with the Democratic organization, and Washington, where perhaps the correspondence dinner is emblematic of a coziness that shouldn't exist? Is how'd you crack it in Boston, and what do you think the bigger message is?
Well, I think that newsrooms take their cue from the leadership, and I think that's true of most organizations. So if someone like me was coming in saying that we ought to pursue this, I think to some degree people in the newsroom saw that as liberating, that they were now freed of this seeming restraints, or perceived restraints on going after the Catholic Church. They were good journalists. They knew that there was an important story here, and now they felt free to pursue it, and they did pursue it, and they pursued it very aggressively.
Do you think that that's a problem in many news markets, the fact that, as the Cardinal said, presumably to you in the movie, whether it was for real or not, the fact that the institutions are better off when they work together? And of course, we know better as journalists. Do you think that that is something that permeates a lot of news, a lot of towns, and a lot of newsrooms?
Not all, but too many. Yes, I do. I think there are many in many markets. There's a feeling that you can't challenge the major institutions, the most powerful institutions. That you have to be you're supposed to be part of the community, you're supposed to have the best interests of the community in mind. And I do think you want the best interests of the community to keep that in mind, but you need to look at that in a broader sense. And obviously, that goes to the mission of this organization as well, and that is there needs to be greater openness, greater transparency, there needs to be accountability.
I know you have resisted this kind of celebrity editor label that was attached to you because of the movie and some of the successes. But practically speaking, do you think that the Spotlight investigation would have ever been conducted the way you conducted it had you not gone to the Globe?
You know, that's really hard for me to address because I wasn't there before, and I don't really know. I mean, the people who are, I mean, you had Sasha and Robbie and who was here? Mike Resendiz here. I think they're the ones to address that, and maybe you ask them as to whether that would have occurred or not, but I don't know. I know that it didn't, so that's all I know.
And, you know, the question that was asked when you arrived wasn't about the kind of journalism you wanted to practice, but would you be cutting the newsroom? And I think I read that over your time there, because of economic pressures, you had to reduce the force by 40%.
Correct.
But you did your best to protect the investigative unit. And I'm just wondering, the Globe is no different from the Tribune or the Sun-Times here in Chicago. The Post has the blessing of Amazon to help you make it a little easier, if that's a blessing, I don't know.
Well,
the Times had to deal
yeah.
with, the Times had to go to Mexico and get a big infusion of cash from Carlos Slim. And I'm just wondering, what's going on?
It's not exactly right. There are a few points. We're not owned by Amazon. We're owned by Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, is a private entity.
Sure.
Carlos Slim didn't make an injection of cash. He bought shares I assume at some point to stabilize the organization right after the Great Recession. So it wasn't like a big infusion of cash that he put in there. But in any event, I mean, I do think, look, I mean, I think that journalism is very much threatened these days. There's no question. I think the business model is a struggle. It's particularly a struggle for regional metropolitan newspapers, perhaps more than any others. We at the Post have completely changed our strategy to focus on a national market and even an international market, leaving behind our strategy of focusing on our metro market, even though we do a lot of local reporting and intend to continue doing aggressive local reporting. But fundamentally, we are trying to be a national news organization. Our challenges are great, but the challenges for metro newspapers are even greater. I do think it's important to recognize that one of the things that I noticed in Boston was that when we did investigative stories, the Spotlight team, that more people would write in and they would say, thank God you're there. This is why we need newspapers. This is why we need the Boston Globe. This is why I buy a subscription. And it was just wonderful to receive notes like that. There was sharp contrast to many of the other notes that I would receive. And I went at one point to our Metro editor and I said, you know, I'd like to do shorter term investigations because I'd like to get these notes more frequently. And we set up a shorter term investigative team just within the Metro staff. And they're now merged. Those two units are merged, and it's a large team. But we did do more investigations, and we did them more frequently. And I think that we have to show our readers over and over and over again why they need us, why we exist, how we can do something that is materially different from what anybody else can do. And so I think it is part of the business model to do investigative journalism. I mean, we see today at the Post, and I think the Times has seen, the New York Times and other newspapers are seeing, that the reason that people are buying subscriptions is because of the investigative journalism that we do. And we're expanding our investigative team at the Post. We're adding 8 people, this is another theme, a rapid response investigative team to turn things around more quickly. And we got immediate support for that. And that was very heartening to see that. And I think it's a recognition that strengthens our bonds with our readers.
And I read that you were adding, is it 60, it's not 60 investigative reporters, is it 60 reporters overall to the
60 journalists of every type.
I see. And so how you as a like me, an older line journalist who didn't grow up in the digital age, how have you adjusted well to the demands of the digital age and the need to push things out in so many new and different ways that we never learned as young journalists?
Oh, well, we have at the Post, for sure. I mean, I think we've really stood out in that regard. So we've been named for a couple of years now as among the most digital media companies in the world. Bezos has invested substantially in our technology. He's also invested in our newsroom. We have, I think, while we've done sort of the authoritative, ambitious journalism, we've also tried to adjust to the ways of the web, recognizing that it is a medium that is distinct from newspapers, from television, from radio, that has its own form of communication that works particularly well, and that there are ways of telling stories on the web and on other digital platforms that are distinct and highly effective. And the reality is that we're publishing on all sorts of different platforms now in different mediums. So we just launched on Snapchat, a couple of months ago, and I can tell you that the form of storytelling on Snapchat is very different from any other platform that we're on.
Well, that's an important.
It comes with music, by the way, just as a start.
And so, as a dedicated, lifelong fact-based journalist who comes from the old line storytelling print world, how difficult is it to make sure that what you send out on these different platforms, some of them designed for very different audiences, is as accurate and reliable as the things that you put in the main sheet of the Post, even with music?
Yeah, well, it's a challenge because we're moving so much more quickly. I mean, we're not only publishing 24/7, we're publishing instantaneously. So you get alerts. You want to be ahead of everybody else, but you have to make sure that alert is accurate. And so that's a challenge. On top of that, you have a highly decentralized newsroom. People are publishing on, we have 2 different tablet apps. We have our mobile website, our mobile app. We have Snapchat. We have, you name it. We're publishing on Amazon Echo now and Google Home, voice-activated devices like that. So the important thing is that you hire good people. I think I participate in every single hiring decision that we make. Every single one. I interview, unless it's absolutely impossible, I interview every single candidate who comes through. And we interview about 3 candidates for every position that we have, so an average. And so we have 60, let's say we're filling 60 positions this year, additional positions of every type, from video to social media to investigative team to breaking news reporters to you name it. So that's 180 people for me to interview. But it's really critical that I participate in those discussions.
So how important do you think it is these days for an entity like the Post, or perhaps it would be the Tribune, the Sun-Times, the New York Times, the LA Times, how important is it to have a Jeff Bezos to be able to really make a big financial commitment? I mean, in our nonprofit world, it's the same thing, whether it's the Texas Tribune, California Watch, ProPublica, Center for Public Integrity. Most of them have had one or more really mega angels, you know, who write the big check that gets you launched and enable you to put together a large staff and focus more on the journalism and the fundraising. You don't have the fundraising pressure, you have the ad pressure, but how important is it to have Jeff as your owner, and how would you see this as a good model for virtually every other newspaper?
Well, it doesn't hurt. That's for sure. It doesn't hurt to be a private company too, by the way. But I think it's important to, I'm not sure that this model can apply to every other news organization. Unfortunately, I wish there were public-spirited people of wealth who would do this sort of thing, but I don't think there are enough out there to support every news organization in the country. But I think it's also important to recognize with regard to the Post that, number one, we're not being treated as a charity, all right? We're not a charity, and we should be grateful for that. Jeff wants us to have a sustainable business model. He's trying to help us achieve one. Last year was our first profitable year in many years, and that was great, but it doesn't mean that the job is over. And as I said, I'm grateful that he doesn't treat it as a charity, because if he were to someday tire of this charity and we didn't have a sustainable business model, we would be in deep trouble. And so I think it's really important. The other thing is that it's not just a matter of money. It's not just financial capital that he is bringing to the Washington Post. It's intellectual capital that he's bringing to the Washington Post. And one is as equally important as the other. And you know, he came in with a fresh thinking about how we might approach things, and a receptivity to our ideas as well, a willingness to finance them, to experiment, to give us what he calls runway, which is basically time for those experiments to play out. So that unlike other news organizations where you basically can come up with maybe a max of two new ideas per year, and then the only way you can get them funded is to basically exaggerate what you think the financial impact is going to be, and then sure enough, 3 months in, they're not meeting their financial goals, and the publisher says, well, let's shut them down. That is not a success. That's not a route to success. So with Jeff, he's given us time, and we don't actually have to produce returns on investment for our proposals. They do have to prove themselves over a period of time, and if they don't work, we want to adapt or shut them down at some point. But we have greater freedom. He thinks in a longer term. I've heard him talk about what we want to be looking like 20 years from now. I never heard that before at a news organization. If anybody talked about 2 years from now, I thought I was lucky.
What's the risk, if any, in having deep-pocketed ownership from a business point of view, a world that, you know, probably on paper tends to be more conservative? If you take, I don't know if you're familiar with DNA Info, which is kind of a localized news operation owned by Joe Ricketts, who's been very active in the political sphere on the conservative side, but from all indications, DNA here in Chicago is a strong independent news organization. I mean, do you feel that your editorial control is independent of any of Jeff's viewpoints, whatever they may be? And I'm not familiar with those, but it could be Jeff, it could be Joe Ricketts, it could be the Koch brothers if they bought a chain of papers. So I'm just saying, what kind of line do you have to draw to maintain editorial integrity?
Well, if we didn't have independence, I wouldn't be there. I can tell you that. I don't need to be there. So Jeff has given us complete independence. He doesn't interfere in the news coverage of the Post. He doesn't want to. Now he wants to know that we're doing a good job and that we're abiding by the professional standards and that we're interesting. I mean, one of the first pieces of advice he gave us was incredibly profound. It was, don't be boring. And you know, newspapers can be boring, so it's like, don't be boring. So, but he stays away from, he doesn't assign stories, he doesn't suggest stories to us, he doesn't critique stories afterwards, he doesn't do any of that. So, you know, I mean, one could say that, I mean, look, I mean, you take donations, you have business people who support you, but you have independence for the journalism that you do here at the BGA. The same is true of the Washington Post. in many ways, it's a matter of choice on the part of the owner, whether they want to get involved or they don't want to get involved. And you know, I don't know how the editorials side of the operation works because I don't get involved in that. I'm not in charge of our editorials or op-ed pages or any of that. But and he certainly is entitled to participate in those conversations. But on the news side of things, he doesn't get involved at all.
I want to talk a little bit about the 45th President of the United States, about whom you have a lot of interesting thoughts. Before I do, a quick question. You've been quoted frequently in recent years expressing your deep, deep concerns about the future of investigative journalism and this glorious profession that we engage in and honor tonight. How would you assess it as we sit here tonight? I know it's in good shape at the Post and probably some other places. We hope it'll be continue to be in good shape at the BGA. But how do you see it on the national scene?
I think it's a mixed picture. I think there's some promising signs, which I'm grateful for. There's some news organizations that have actually enhanced their investigative reporting. I was encouraged to see that some people were inspired by the movie, which was great. I believe the San Francisco Chronicle, they actually they created an investigative team after the publisher saw Spotlight, from what I understand, which is great. You see outfits like CNN expanding their investigative team, which I think is terrific. BuzzFeed has an investigative team. There are also new organizations that have cropped up over the past several years that are doing investigative reporting. Your awardee here tonight, written for The Intercept, that's a new one, funded by somebody of some wealth here in Midyar. And so I think there's some promising signs there that there's more money being put into investigative reporting, and I think that many metro newspapers are beginning to recognize, as I said before, that readers want that and will support that with subscriptions.
What are your thoughts about the rise of online investigative organizations? We're one, ProPublica. The nation has a few of them, and they're growing and actually doing pretty well in terms of donations in recent months because of the desire to have this kind of fact-based journalism. Is that a good trend?
Oh, no question. I mean, the more the merrier, as far as I'm concerned. It's more competition for us, but that's fine. We also collaborate with a number of institutions. So we collaborate with ProPublica. We've collaborated with the Texas Tribune. We actually have a partnership with them. We have collaborated with the Marshall Project. So we're delighted with that. And you have good people. So I did not know until I came here tonight that my superb former colleagues, Bob Sector and David Tidwell, are part of your organization. And David was at the Miami Herald when I was there, and Bob was at the LA Times when I was there. So I've been around long enough and worked in enough places that I pretty much intersect with everybody in our profession.
And we have an interest in becoming a collaborator with the Washington Post. We can talk about that another time. Let me ask about
one of your staffers already mentioned that.
Oh, good. Good. Donald Trump, you had an interesting quote which said that you took Trump seriously from the beginning, and I wasn't quite sure what you meant by that. You meant at the beginning of the primary process, or what? And what did that mean in terms of the coverage?
What I meant by that is, as soon as he entered the campaign, it was clear that he was going to be a serious candidate. Some people were treating him as not a serious candidate, as entertainment. Huffington Post even said they were putting him on the entertainment pages, although they still had a political reporter covering him, so I'm not sure that meant anything really in substance. But it was clear, particularly after he started talking about Mexicans and as rapists and all that sort of thing, he went up in the polls. He had about 30% of the support of the GOP electorate right away. And in a field as large as the GOP field at the time, it was pretty apparent that he was going to be the leader in that field if he had 30%. And so we immediately set out to sort of figure out, first of all, looking into his own background in depth. We even did a book on it called Trump Revealed, and assigned 20 people to the book alone, on top of the people who were covering the campaign. But we also spent a lot of time with his supporters, people who were not just giving him their support, but giving him their devotion. And we wanted to understand who they were, what was driving them, what was motivating them. And so we did take him seriously from the very beginning.
And
in every respect.
And you won a Pulitzer Prize for your deep dive into the Trump Foundation.
Right.
Obviously, you're proud of that. What do you make of the first 100+ days of this administration, which has been filled with a phenomena that I don't ever think we've seen in our lifetime, which is an ongoing battle with legacy media, and the claim that you and others produce fake news and alternative facts when frequently it looks like it's the other way around. What do you think's going on, and how do you see it play? How do you cover this?
Well, look, he's called us every name in the book. He's called us disgusting and scum and the lowest form of humanity, and then when that wasn't enough, he called us the lowest form of life. And then that wasn't enough either, because then he went on to call us enemy of the people. You know, I mean, I think that people have looked at this. There have been some, I think, astute analyses of this, and the objective here is to discredit us as independent monitors of his performance, and to portray us as using the language that they themselves have used as the opposition party. So if you are perceived as the opposition party, then the public will discount what you are reporting, because they just view it as a partisan matter. They don't view you as an independent journalist holding government accountable. And so that's their objective, is to marginalize us, to discredit us, and I think even given the language that they've used, to dehumanize us. And so that's what they're all about. I mean, it's an odd thing, because it's also an incredibly, well, he's the most accessible president we've ever seen. He gives interviews all the time. He invites journalists into the Oval Office and talks to them. He did that with us the other day to explain why he reversed course on NAFTA. Even acknowledging things that his staff had told us weren't true. He just flatly acknowledged them. And when he withdrew the healthcare plan, he immediately got on the phone to our reporter, Bob Costa, and told him, I'm withdrawing the healthcare plan. At which point, Bob was on Twitter saying, I'm speaking to the president. He's withdrawing the healthcare plan. And then he got on the phone with the New York Times. And so this is really, and then, you know, people at the White House we have a professional relationship with them. You know, in private, an amiable relationship with them. They'll talk to us. But in public, they seek to discredit us. And I think it's more important what they say in public, because that has had a corrosive effect. It undermines the credibility of journalism. I think the polls have demonstrated that it's having its effect, and that's exactly what they want. And at the same time, they're not being transparent. They may give you an interview, but that's what they say. What you want to look at is what they do. And so, look, the president has not released his tax returns, which is something that, you know, presidents for years have done. And so he's not being transparent in that regard. And most recently, they decided that they weren't going to release the visitor logs to the White House, claiming that there was a national security danger. But there was already a national security exception to the visitor logs. So we'll have to see how they respond to FOIAs and things like that. They're also talking about, they're discussing the possibility of prosecuting WikiLeaks. You know, people can have all their different views of WikiLeaks, but they would be prosecuting them under the Espionage Act of 1917. And, you know, there's some concern that they could apply the same principle to other news organizations on leaks of classified.
And you published that material, so would they sue you?
Well, we'll have to see.
And so, you know, we love keeping.
We did, you know, along with the Guardian, we did publish the NSA,
right.
The NSA document. So.
We love keeping score on these things, like they're all sporting events, but it's obviously more serious than that. But who do you think's winning after these 100 days, as you and other news organizations attempt to ferret out the truth and the facts, and they attempt to discredit your efforts? And it all plays out in the public arena in some form or another.
Well, I would say the cage match is not over just yet. So, I mean, I think that they're showing some success. There was a Quinnipiac poll that showed that something like 81% of Republicans today believe that certain members of the media are, in fact, enemies of the American people. 81% of Republicans. Now, thankfully, not independents and not Democrats, but it's concerning when so many people in the Republican Party think that way, and very worrisome. And also, there was another poll that showed that 36% of Republicans believe that press freedom can do more harm than good. That is concerning, because if there's anything that makes our country exceptional, it's the Bill of Rights, and probably most particularly the First Amendment. And so we need support among the public for press freedoms, not just press freedoms, but freedom of speech, freedom of expression, all the other freedoms that are there, freedom to petition the government, freedom to peaceably assemble, and freedom of religion, which is in there as well. And all those freedoms are primarily intended to hold government to account. That's why they were included in the first place. And so we need support among the public for those freedoms. It's not enough for the press to say we're entitled to them. We also have to have public support.
And two more questions, and I'll let you go. And one is, we're all human, those of us who we're in the news business, and we try to be fair and objective and truthful. But when you're battered the way you and many others have been by the Trump folks, can you maintain a kind of an equanimity and a fairness and an objectivity when you're vilified so thoroughly that the basic human tendency would be to basically lash back out? And I don't know, I think it does happen in some venues, but how do you protect against that when it's so tempting to basically just throw it back at him? Or not just him, but his team.
I don't think we do that. I don't think we need to do that. I think it would be counterproductive for us to do that. I think we would undermine our own credibility if we were to engage in that kind of behavior. And the truth is that most of us who've been in the business for a long time, we've dealt with criticism in the past, but we understand our obligations to actually do a fair job, to be honest, honorable, accurate, and fair in our jobs. I also think it's important that we be fair to the public, and to me that means we do our work, we do it thoroughly, we do it accurately, but then we tell people what we found, and we don't mask it, we don't muddle it, we actually tell people what we found, and we're unflinching in that regard. And so I think there's another aspect of fairness, and that is, let's tell people what we discovered.
Let's finish where we began, which was the clip from Spotlight, and let me ask you how your life has changed after you were portrayed in the movie by a star, and the movie won the Academy Award. And I would say it did a tremendous service to our profession, and you as a lifelong editor have to be extraordinarily gratified by the uplifting effect of the movie on the profession. But how about you personally, as you move around? I suspect that you got a warmer welcome at the Post than you did at the Boston Globe.
Well, first of all, the movie came out after I was when I was already at the Post. I mean, I already knew a lot of people at the Post. I didn't know anybody at the Globe. So I knew probably 24 people at the Post when I arrived there. And thankfully, at least a substantial majority said nice things about me. So that was helpful. The movie was, I never told anybody that was in the works until it actually appeared in the Hollywood press at some point. And then people discovered it. I never thought the movie would get made. I thought it was highly improbable that this movie would ever get made. I mean, it has no action scenes, no superheroes, certainly no romance. Quite the opposite.
No sex, no nudity?
Let's talk about sex, but not the kind that generally takes people. It's not like a date movie. So it's not exactly a date movie. And then, we got a new pope, and it was like a popular pope. And I thought to myself, well, they will never make this movie now. Finally they have a popular pope instead of an unpopular pope, and they're not going to come out with a movie now. And sure enough, that's when it all came together. It shows you what I know about Hollywood, nothing. I mean, the impact on me has been, it's been weird because, you know, yesterday I was in Washington, which is a media-savvy town, of course, but I was going home, walking home, which I live within walking distance, and 2 people stopped me in the street. In fact, one does work for BGA. It's bizarre. And he said, oh, I said, who are you? He says, oh, I do some stuff for BGA. I said, I'm going to be there tomorrow.
Neubauer.
I thought you guys were chasing me, like investigating me on the streets of Washington before I got here to make sure there wasn't anything you didn't know about. So I was a little nervous about that. But and it was, my brother was visiting once, and we were at several people had stopped me while he was in town, and then we went to the Arboretum in Washington, which is this huge open expanse of space. We get out of the car, we're going to the visitor center, and some guy and his wife are going by on their bikes, and he stops his bike, and it says, are you Marty Baron? And my brother looks at me, and he's like, what is going on here? And it's just like, it's unbelievable. So it's been weird, it's been strange that way, but I would call it a low-grade celebrity. So. Very low-grade celebrity. But what it has done is that it's certainly led to more requests for me to speak. I get about 4 invitations a week now to speak all over the country and all over the world. And you know, I do more of those that are in the country because I can get there more quickly and get back. So while a colleague of mine was going to Perugia to speak, I went to Kansas, so which was great, and it was a wonderful. Actually, I had a wonderful time there, really, and they were incredibly welcoming. But it was a place I could get to and get back quickly, but it's an opportunity for me. It's a privilege that I've been given, and a responsibility that I've been given to talk about what we do and why it's important and how we should be going about it, and try to talk to not just the people who feel a closeness to our mission, but other people who might be more skeptical about it, and at least have an honest, frank conversation with people, and civil conversation, which there's so little opportunity to have a civil conversation.
And here's how we got Marty here. So I invited him, and first thing he said was his schedule's too busy and he doesn't want to write another speech. Mm-hmm. And I said, don't write another speech, come out and have a conversation. And that was the one that worked, because it's obviously easier to have these. These have been the new way of doing the BGA conversations. I think they're better for both sides.
Absolutely.
So let me let you have the last word and ask you to leave this audience with just a few thoughts about what we do, its importance, and where we're going. I mean, this is a crowd that is either practicing journalism or passionate about it, and really cares about the work we do and its potential to give us the government we deserve. It's what I talked about a lot. We have a democracy that's I think, quivering right now in many ways, and I think we're one of the ways we can bolster that democracy if we do our jobs right. So what's the final message to this group tonight?
Well, you pretty much gave it,
Sorry.
I took the words right out of my mouth. Look, I mean, I think that journalism does a lot of things, but I think the highest purpose of journalism is to hold powerful institutions and powerful individuals to account. And we have to continue on that course. I think the public expects that of us. I think if we didn't do that, they would never forgive us. And I don't think they should forgive us if we abandon that mission. And so I think that we have to stay at it. I worry about what's happening in so many cities and towns across the country where there are very few journalists, and there are certainly very few investigative journalists. In many state capitals, you may have 1, maybe 2 reporters from the biggest newspaper in the state. That reporter is expected to cover the governor, both houses of the legislature, all the different agencies, the politics, and the policy. There's not a lot of time for basic reporting. There's certainly not a lot of time for investigative reporting. At the last data I saw was that there was something like, in 27 states have no journalist covering their congressional delegations in Washington. So they have nobody in Washington covering their congressional delegations. That's astounding, and I think it's dangerous. And I think it's dangerous that we don't have enough people covering our politicians, our policymakers, And I think people also in the private sector and in the nonprofit sector who also deserve the same kind of scrutiny. And so my hope is that there will be a great awareness of what it is we do, what we lose when we don't have journalists, and a greater appreciation on the part of the public that they need to support this kind of work.
Marty, thanks for coming out. I want to give you our takeaway present. It's what I give out to anybody that takes the time to listen to us and talk to us. This is our Shining a Light on Government pen, which I shine in everyone's eyes.
Well, you're already blinding me here, so that's okay.
It's a pen, a stylus. Thanks so much.